The lecture for today. As I mentioned in the chapter 1 lecture, this course is heavily theoretical. Other Poli-Sci 20 courses and other world politics books tend to be more empirical based. So there's a direct connection between explaining what's going on in the real world at the given point in time. The problem with those types of books is that they go out of date quickly. And 10, 15 years from now, the knowledge that you gain in the introductory class might not be as useful as it was closer to the time you took the course. This course is very theoretical based. Now, the advantage, of course, is that you have a lot of foundational work that can explain what's going on in the world, regardless of the time that you are taking it or the time that you're recalling the information. The negative, of course, is the fact that theory can be a little bit nebulous, and it's not always clear how this connects to the real world. I hope to fix that deficiency as the course goes on, but throughout the course, do try to apply what you are learning to what's going on in the real world to try to make a connection. Okay, so with that said, what is a theory? A theory is simply a collection of propositions that explains a phenomenon by specifying relationships among a set of concepts. So in our case, take the phenomenon of war. How do we explain why this phenomenon occurs? Well, we have dependent and explanatory variables, also known as independent variables. And different theories have different explanatory variables that explain the phenomenon of war. So one such example is the democratic peace theory. And it posits that conflict proneness is the product of regime type. And so the number of democracies in the international system will have an impact on the level of conflict proneness in the international system. The dependent variable, of course, again, is the presence or absence of war, and the explanatory or so-called independent variable is the the number of democracies in the international system. Theories generate hypotheses. So again, the hypothesis for the democratic peace theory is that democracies don't go to war with each other. This is testable and falsifiable by looking at the number of democracies and the frequency of conflict among them. If the democratic peace theory is correct, we would expect to find few, if any, conflicts among democratic regimes. So as a spoiler, the democratic peace theory is consistent with observations. Since 1945, there's only been one example of two democracies going to war with each other. How do we know if a theory is powerful or so-called good theory? Well, they are typically generalizable. They will explain events across time and space. Examples of this include Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, heliocentrism, general and special relativity. These are theories that go beyond what they were initially trying to explain and explain a broader set of phenomenon and continue to have explanatory value as we learn more about the real world. So what do theories do? Well, in international relations, they explain the best courses of action and why things happen. Now, keep in mind that as we gain more data and we gain more insights into the real world, a good theory is one that is tolerant of ambiguity, tolerant of revision, is distrustful of absolutes, and allows us to make alterations to the theories without the theory having to be completely disregarded. In the harder sciences, theories typically have a lot more scientific explanatory power. That is, they usually can do a lot more to explain what is going on. In the social sciences, particularly in political science, they rarely achieve the status of scientific laws. They're generally tools to explain a broad set of behavior. John Mearsheimer likes to say, he's one of the leading IR scholars, likes to say that a good theory in international relations will be right 80% of the time. This is usually not the case in the harder sciences, where a theory usually will typically explain something closer to 100% of the time. These theoretical perspectives are sets of theories united by some common themes. So we will be discussing those major categories in the lecture today. But realism, liberalism, constructionism, and so-called radicalism, which includes Marxism, are theoretical perspectives that are united by common themes, but have sub-theories inside of them that have differences among them. And we'll get more into that as we go through the individual theories. Finally, as I go through each theory, keep in mind that I will be wearing the hat of that theory. That is, I will be arguing as if that theory is correct. This is just for ease, rather than saying something like, according to Marxism or according to realism, blah, blah, blah. I will just be talking as if that theory was true. But that's just there for ease and to make this lecture go as smooth as possible, not necessarily a value judgment on those theories. Okay, so let's get started. So the first theory that we'll be talking about is constructivism. It's perhaps the youngest of the IR theories, coming into its own in the 1990s. Until recently, constructivism was mainly a tool of criticism rather than a school of thought that provided its own tools for explaining and predicting outcomes. According to constructivism, state behavior is shaped by elite beliefs, identities, and social norms. Constructivism explains international politics by focusing on norms and the identities of individuals and states. The identities of the states stem from the behavior and the interpretation of these identities by other actors. When states have divergent identities, it can lead them to have identities and interests, it can lead them to have interests and ideals that are opposed to one another. Another aspect of constructivism is the fact that interests and identity are ever changing. So unlike other theories that we'll be discussing today, one of constructivism's major theoretical proposition is that neither objects, states, NGOs, etc., nor concepts such as anarchy or sovereignty have any necessary fixed or objective meaning. That is, what a state is not objectively true. What anarchy is not objectively true, while states and anarchy exist, they are not objective artifacts that exist independent of the constructed meaning that is applied to them. For constructivists, for example, constructivists believe that a state's behavior is shaped by elite beliefs, identities, and social norms. So as elite beliefs, identities, and social norms change, the state's behavior will alter, and therefore the state's identity with other states will change. Constructivists see power in discursive terms. That is to say that power is a dialogue between two states or two actors. The power of ideas, culture, language are as important as the material sources of power. So unlike other schools of thought, which see power as being just material capability, how much steel you have, what's your population, how many nuclear weapons you have, power in constructivism is also reflected in your ability to impact and shape the international system, the norms of the international system, and how states should act as a normative judgment. In this light, sovereignty is a contested concept. So states don't have the ability to exclusively control what sovereignty is, and therefore sovereignty is consistently challenged by institutions' new needs and the growing power of different states. Okay, so the next school that we'll be talking about is liberalism. And depending on what school, that is to say, what university you go to, liberalism may or may not be the dominant school of thought to explain international relations. Here at UCLA, for example, liberalism is pretty much the dominant school of thought to explain international relations. Again, as I mentioned in week one, it's important to note here that when we say liberalism, we're not talking about the American political system, anyone who's left of center, right? We are talking about liberalism, the sort of lowercase L theory of how the world works. So it's not necessarily the case. So when I talk about liberalism, try to keep in mind that I'm not talking about the Democratic Party or anything that's sort of left of center. Liberalism is a diverse set of theories that highlight the impact of internal characteristics and their role on the international system. We don't have time to give liberalism the full attention that it deserves. You could take an entire course on liberal IR theory. However, we are restricted to a portion of this lecture. That said, there are three major sub-theories inside of liberalism. The first is domestic institutionalism. The second is the democratic peace theory. And the third is neoliberal institutionalism. But before we jump into those, let's talk about the roots of liberalism. So John Locke, as opposed to Hobbes, believed that humans in the state of nature possess qualities of reason and logic. Humans do not leave the state of nature because without government, life would be short, nasty, and brutish, as Hobbes suggests, but rather because life without government is costly. Humans enter into a social contract with each other because it would be, in Locke's terms, inconvenient to protect ourselves or our rights or resolve disputes without violence in a world without a government. So consider the following example. Connor sells beer. Gavin sells apples. Connor and Gavin are going to exchange their goods. Connor has extra beer, Gavin has extra apples. They exchange their goods, and on the way home, Connor finds out that the apples are rotten before he's able to get home. Without government, Connor must either accept his losses or resort to violence in order to get back the losses that he incurred. With a government, a legitimate government, that is, one that is based on the consent of the people, Connor can go to court to recoup his losses and find a peaceful settlement to the dispute. So in this view, while government curtails our liberties, the ability to do whatever we want, whenever we want, according to Locke, we are better off with government. The second route that is important to IR theory, at least in this truncated explanation of liberalism, is Immanuel Kant, his work, Perpetual Peace, a Philosophical Sketch. Kant points out that there is a disconnect between the interest of the monarch and the interest of his subjects. Kings typically do not bear the burdens of war, but reap most of its benefits. On the other hand, his subjects typically enjoy little of the rewards, but suffer most of the cost. As a result, a king will therefore be tempted to go to war, even if such a war is unnecessary. Kant believed that republican states, that is, what we would call a liberal democracy, a representative style democracy, in which the decision to declare war rest on the consent of its citizens, would be very cautious in considering all of the costs before getting themselves into a risky war that might not be beneficial. So in this way, liberalism, the ability of a legitimate government, curtails conflict and produces cooperation because the cost of the going to war are bared on the people who have the ability to decide if a country ultimately goes to war or not. Okay, so as I mentioned, there are three major sub-schools in the school of liberalism. The first emphasizes the role of domestic institutions. And there are four institutions that we're going to be talking about, or that are most relevant. The first, of course, is the leader, whether that's a king or queen, or a president or prime minister. They are the people who ultimately make foreign policy decisions. Below them, we have bureaucratic actors such as the state and military, the Department of State and the military. These are actors that are part of the government, that can influence the government, but don't have direct control over foreign policy making. Below them, you have interest groups, which use their lobbying power to affect policy. And then, of course, you have the general public. So one way that leaders may influence foreign policy is through their own, again, self-interest. So there's a concept known as the rally around the flag effect. And this is the observation that leaders who undergo a national crisis, typically a foreign crisis, will see an increase in their approval rating. So if you remember back to just the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis, Donald Trump's approval ratings, which were around the low 40s, spiked up to about 50%. Now, they subsided again, but this is consistent with a rally around the flag effect. A better example is actually George W. Bush right after 9/11. He experienced an approval rating of 90% right after 9/11. Leaders can abuse this rally around the flag effect in order to increase their popularity. So in non-democracies, a leader might cause a conflict to seek legitimacy, and a democratic leader might be tempted to start a conflict around an election in order to increase the probability of being reelected. As I mentioned, this next level is bureaucratic actors. So we again don't have a lot of time to discuss this. There's entire courses at UCLA that talk about bureaucratic politics. If you're interested in this, I would recommend Debbie Larson's American Foreign Policy course. But effectively, bureaucratic politics can be summed up with you are where you sit. That is, what part of the government you belong to determines how you will support foreign policy, or what foreign policy proposals you will advance. Different actors have different preferences, which shape their willingness and tolerance for war. The next group is interest groups. So these interest groups have preferences that differ from the national interest, and preferences that differ from one another. Some groups may benefit from war, and some groups may be completely against war because it would be totally against their interests. How are these groups successful in shaping foreign policy? Well, the logic of collective action. Smaller groups are typically better organized. They have a smaller set of interests, and therefore are able to apply those interests more effectively and have more influence on foreign policy debate. So think about the NRA. The NRA is a perfect example of this. It has a very narrow set of interests, and even though it's a relatively small group, it has had a large impact on American politics. So as these different interest groups compete with one another, in the aggregate, there will be a prevailing shaping of foreign policy for that given point in time, resulting in the foreign policy choices made by the executive or by the nation as a whole. The last level is the general public. That's you and me. The general public opposes war, although they can be manipulated by leaders, bureaucratic actors, and interest groups. In general, though, these institutions check one another. And in legitimate governments, that is representative democracies, liberal democracies, those checks on each other motivate the actors to find peaceful solutions to international crises, akin to how actors use courts to settle disputes domestically. And here is just a slide showing the different regime types. You'll notice that around the world, particularly in the Western Hemisphere and in Europe, democracies are the prominent regime type. The second school of thought inside the liberal school is the democratic peace theory. And democratic institutions discourage war. domestically, as I mentioned, they force consensus between elites and the masses. Leaders are accountable to the public and therefore will only go to war if a war is in the benefit of the country. Additionally, the democratic process is slow. And so this leaves time for countries in a dispute to find a peaceful solution without jumping the gun and going to war. It's not easy for a democracy to wind up the war machine. In 9/11, it wasn't until it was almost an entire month later that Congress got around to authorizing conflict and the use of force in Afghanistan. And that was, of course, a clear example of the United States being attacked. The debate for the Iraq War was closer to 6 months. And so when two democracies go to war with one another, it allows for time where peaceful solutions can be negotiated and war can be avoided. Some democratic peace theorists make a stronger argument that relies on more than just the fact that democracies are slow, or that you need to have consensus between leaders and the people. These scholars argue that shared democratic norms changes the bargaining interaction altogether. So because democracies have mutual respect for one another, akin to how citizens in a country have mutual respect for one another, it simply is inconceivable for democratic countries to go to war with one another. And if a crisis or conflict emerges, they're just not going to go to war with each other because it is normatively against their essence of doing so. This might explain why democracies are so much more likely to go to war with autocracies, despite the fact that we would expect to find if other theories, if the other elements of democratic peace theory were correct. So if it were just simply the case that because the democratic process is slow, that that affects the ability for that has a negative impact on the ability to go to war, or the speed of which a country can go to war, we would expect to see democracies to not go to war with autocracies. So just to reiterate, because I got lost in my own thoughts there, if it was simply the case that democracies don't go to war because democracies slow down the war process, we would expect to find it to be the case that democracies don't go to war with autocracies as well. But that's not what we observe. We observe that democracies don't go to war with each other. So this normative explanation of the democratic peace theory fills in that lacuna by arguing that it's a norm-based argument. Democracies just don't go to war with each other because it's normatively against their values to do so. Regardless of the fact that it's institutions or leaders or the slowness of democracy or norms, democracies don't go to war with each other. And to a smaller extent, democracies are less war prone than autocracies are towards one another. We'll spend more time on this, but again, as I mentioned, Kant isn't entirely correct. Democracies go to war with each other, but just not as frequently as they do just as frequently as autocracies go to war with each other. The last school of thought inside the liberal school is neoliberal institutionalism. And this is a school of thought that claims that institutions do not exist as a means to promote values, but rather solve collective action problems at the international level. So think back to my example with Connor and Galvin, and instead think of the United States and France. You know, absent an international government, if the United States abuses France in a trade, France's only options are to either accept the losses or go to war with the United States. These institutions are not a government per se, but are ways to facilitate these interactions in such a way that abuses do not occur. So why would these states join these institutions? Well, states, according to neoliberal institutionalism, are still the dominant actor, but their behavior is constrained by international interdependency. States are rational actors and they seek to maximize profit, but they are more concerned with absolute gains than relative gains. So absolute gains are a situation where suppose I have $100 and you have $50. We both gain $10. In terms of absolute gains, we have gained the same. But in relative gains, I am still ahead of you because I now have $110 and you have $60. Liberalism, particularly neoliberal institutionalism, argues that states are primarily motivated by these absolute gains rather than relative gains. So without government, it's not possible to solve all collective action problems, right? There's always going to be the ability to cheat and the ability to avoid punishment for cheating. But by voluntarily joining international institutions, you can minimize the probability of cheating and therefore the probability of being abused, and therefore increase your overall wealth and overall absolute gains. Similar to the way in which Connor and Gavin are better off with a judge who can issue rulings. States that voluntarily join an international institution are better off, even though they've given up some of their sovereignty, because the benefits of cheating are mitigated. So what's important here is that the joining of these institutions is not because of some normative advantage, right? It's not because we're trying to make the world a better place, although that certainly happens. Rather, states join these institutions in their own self-interest. The second school of thought that we'll be going over is feminism. So the feminist school of thought is perhaps the most underexplored school of thought in textbooks and in courses on international relations. For example, at UCLA, I can't think of a single course that mentions feminism, let alone a standalone course on the topic. Although I hope that changes with courses in the political theory subfield. Most books don't even mention feminism as an alternative. And even this book provides just a cursory exposure to the theory. To that end, and to fill in these gaps, I urge you to watch the video to get a fuller view on the theory. Again, if you just click on this link on the slides where it says international relations, feminism, and international relations, that is a hyperlink. And there's an 11-minute video on feminism that I urge you to watch to get a better and more full view than is offered in the book or what I could offer in the brief time that we have to talk about these theories in this lecture. So one of the key differences between feminism and the other theories of feminism is the fact that it points to the exclusions and biases of mainstream IR. So feminism shares many of the constructivist assumptions. It argues specifically that social discourse has been dominated by men, and that the exclusion of women's voices affects the questions we ask and how we evaluate the answers. So just as constructivism is a discursive theory where what sovereignty means depends on how we view sovereignty, feminism points out that how we view gender norms and who is allowed to speak inside of the academy invariably shapes our perspectives on these concepts. And because women have historically been excluded in policymaking, in government, and indeed even in the academy, how we view international relations is affected by that exclusion. According to some views of feminism, the world would be a more peaceful place if women had a greater role in domestic and international affairs. This is the view that is shared by so-called realist and liberal feminists. And so they seek to increase women's roles in social, economic, and political roles to increase the passivity of the international system and to make conflict less likely. Other views, so-called radical views, view the international system as well as domestic politics as inherently paternalistic, as being the examples of the patriarchy. And as long as these systems exist, women will be in a subservient position until they can rise up and break down those systems. The major criticisms that feminism has for the other schools of thought are as follows. They reject the notion that the state is the central actor. Feminists advance novel critiques of the longer standing theories of international relations. For example, J. Ann Tickner, argues that classical realism is a fundamentally masculine view. And by viewing actors as the central actor, it inherently makes women as a mere onlooker. Instead, feminists argue that non-state actors play as much of a role in shaping international relations as state actors, and that varying hierarchies exist in their ability to shape the international system. Feminism also rejects the notion of the state as a unitary actor. So remember, according to rationalist explanations, including realism and liberalism, the state can be black boxed as a single person. That's because, if you recall, aggregates of people act similar to how a person acts. Feminists argue that by treating the state as a unitary actor, traditional schools invariably uplift masculine voices at the expense of female voices. Feminists also reject the notion that power is simply a materialistic good. Again, by viewing power in this terms of material goods, it invariably uplifts power as being a masculine force, ignoring the social and ideational, that is, the power of ideas, and shaping international relations. Lastly, traditional schools of thought focus on the so-called national interest. And feminists critique this by claiming whose interest? Since men have traditionally dominated the state, domestic politics, and indeed the international system, the national interest is invariably incomplete. And by increasing the role of women in international politics beyond a male perspective would alter what the national interest is and broaden the criteria which foreign and other policies are assessed. Okay. The next school of thought is realism, which is perhaps the largest and most popular school outside of UCLA. U Chicago, where I got my master's degree, is very much a realist school of thought. It is the oldest of the schools. Again, like liberalism, it is a collection of sub-theories that we don't have time to go over in individual detail. So we'll be painting with broad strokes here to describe what realism is. So some of the assumptions of realism. The first is that the state is the principal actor in international relations. It is a unitary actor and acts with one voice. Decision makers are rational actors who have goals and aims and use their power to achieve those goals and aims. The primary goal is security. States must protect themselves first from foreign and domestic enemies. As a result of this, realism is a pessimistic view, has a pessimistic view of human nature. Because stemming from Hobbes, it views that absent in a world without government, and since a world government is impossible, life in the international system is short, nasty, and brutish. Because the international system is anarchic and will remain anarchic, states can only rely on themselves to protect themselves against other powers, and therefore must seek out power to protect themselves. States increase their power in two ways. First, through war and conquest, and the second is through balancing, taking actions to offset the power of a more powerful state by temporarily allying with a weaker state to deter the actions of the larger state. Again, remember that, like liberalism, realism is not a single unified theory, but a family of theories. Most realist thought is actually neorealism, introduced by Kenneth Waltz's theory of international politics, which gives precedence to the structure of the international system over individual states as an explanatory factor. Neorealism advances two normative arguments and one theoretical argument. So the first normative argument is that we need theory to understand international politics. So unlike previous schools of thought, this school of thought, which came around in the 1950s as a result of World War II, emphasizes the importance of theory to make explanations and predictions about the real world. Prior to this, of course, international relations was a subject of U.S. history and was simply a way of a lens through which we would look at history. After Kenneth Waltz, international relations became much more theoretical based, as theory was seen as a tool to understand international politics in of itself. Additionally, neorealism explains international politics after the advent of the Westphalia state system. So neorealism doesn't make any claims or arguments about the international system prior to Westphalia. In order to explain the international system, you need sovereignty, and therefore you can only have explain international relations since Westphalia. Lastly, neorealism is a theoretical argument that explores the relationship of war and peace based on the distribution of power. So neorealists posit that it is the structure of the system and the distribution of power that determines outcomes. The power distribution of a system can be one of three possibilities: unipolar, bipolar, and multipolar. Some neorealists argue that unipolarity, which is what we have now, there's only one superpower, the United States, increases the likelihood of peace because no other country would dare go to war against the United States, and so therefore the benefits of going to war are completely mitigated. Other neorealists argue that bipolarity, the system that we had under the Cold War, in which there are two superpowers, maximizes the peace because you have clear delineated balance of power. Either you're with the United States or you're with the Soviet Union, and that clear delineation makes it much more difficult for any errors to occur or for misunderstandings to occur to lead to conflict. It should be noted that this view of international relations, the neorealist school of thought, sees international organizations and institutions not as forces of cooperation, but another tool for the great powers and superpowers to exert power over weaker states and to solidify their power in the international system. The last school of thought that we will be talking about today is the Marxist school of thought. And this school of thought has, after the Cold War, exited international relations discourses, and you would be hard pressed to find it in any course on international relations. This is because, of course, after the Soviet Union fell, Marxism was dismissed as an alternative to anything in the Western system. More recently, Marxism has started to reemerge as a theory of itself to explain international relations. So one caveat that I would like to bring up first is, because realism is typically associated with the right, it is erroneously believed that Marxism is the anti-realism. Again, it's very important to remember that these theories do not map on to political preferences, and nor do they map on to political parties. Instead, what I would like you to notice in these next few minutes is to recognize the similarities between Marxism, the IR theory, and realism. Marxism, of course, is influenced by Marx. An oversimplification to be sure, but he developed a theory of the evolution of capitalism based on economic change and class conflict, which are fundamental to all radical thought. So, according to Marxism, capitalism inherently creates a hierarchy between the capital class, those who own industry, think of Jeff Bezos, and the labor class, those who work, so the people who work in Amazon factories. Capitalism inherently creates competition to gain more capitalism and to avoid exploitation of those in the capital class. This exploitation invariably leads to conflict across the globe. So, what does this all mean? Well, John Hobson theorized that the expansion of capitalism results in an overproduction of goods in developed countries. Think of the so-called first world, and underconsumption by workers in developing worlds. This leads to imperialism in less developed areas and rivalry for markets among developed countries. So this should sound familiar to what we were just discussing with the realist school of thought. The quest for wealth leads not to cooperation, according to liberals, but rather competition with weaker states suffering what they will. According to the Marxist school of thought, capitalism, as long as capitalism exists, states will vie for power, competing with one another and imposing their will on weaker countries to increase their own wealth. According to the Marxist school of thought, schools use multinational corporations and institutions to obtain cheap primary goods, raw goods, from dependent states, developing countries, and use them to produce manufactured goods, which are more expensive than the raw goods taken from the developing country. These are then sold back to the dependent state, into the developing state at a profit at the expense of the developing country. Over time, this increases inequality and underdevelopment. And just like realists, Marxists are pessimistic about the possibility of change without a radical transformation of the human experience. Again, this should sound familiar with key changes about from power being the primary tool to capital being the primary tool in realism, in Marxism, sorry. Okay, so to wrap up, consider some of the ongoing crises shaping the world today. Remember what a theory does. It generates hypotheses, testable and falsifiable statements, positing a relationship among variables. To evaluate the strength of a theory, we generate specific falsifiable statements, positing a particular relationship between two or more variables. These statements can, in principle, be tested and falsified by real-world evidence. Using the ongoing crises, evaluate these theories, which best explains what's going on. Use that insight for your discussion question for chapter 3, which again is due Saturday at 11:59 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. Hopefully this was helpful for you, and I look forward to seeing you again with chapter 4.